It's February 2025 and I'm going to end this weekend riding a 45-tonne, 12-metre tall wooden steel elephant through a long-abandoned shipyard in the historic ducal capital of Brittany. It's quite the weekend. "50 kilometres inland from the Atlantic coast, a major inland port on the Loire River, and today the sixth largest city in France, Nantes was historically one of the most important cities in Brittany, but controversially today is the administrative seat of both the Pays de Loire region and the Loire-Atlantique department, and not Brittany. The earliest signs of habitation in the area that is today Nantes date back to just the Bronze Age, significantly later than surrounding regions which have Neolithic monuments. The small iron and tin deposits in the region's subsoil attracted traders with resources from the area travelling as far as Ireland, though it took nearly 1,000 years of trading before local industry started to appear around 900 BCE. There is little information on the area between those early Bronze Age finds and the arrival of the Romans during the reign of Tiberius at the start of the 1st century. Nantes remained allied to the Roman Empire up until its collapse in the 5th century, at which point it changed hands between the Franks and Visigoths and kept as a stronghold against the Bretons. Under Charlemagne, the town became the capital of the Breton Marsh, a buffer zone protecting his empire from invasion by the Bretons, and whilst it was successful during his reign, following Charlemagne's death, the Bretons invaded and seized Nantes in 850. Over the following 100 years, the town changed hands between the Bretons and Vikings a couple of times before the Norse were finally expelled from the town in 937 by Alain II, Duke of Brittany. During the 14th century, there was a war of succession in Brittany, which eventually ended with the ascent of the House of Montfort to the ducal throne. The new rulers chose Nantes, by then the largest town in Brittany, as their main residence, carrying out further works to strengthen the, by then over 100-year-old, Château des Dukes of Brittany. Port traffic became increasingly important in the city, with a growing foreign trade business exporting salt, wine, fabrics and hemp. The 15th century represented the pinnacle of the first golden age of Nantes, with many of the buildings, including the castle and cathedral, being built or rebuilt, and the founding of the University of Nantes in 1460. In 1491, Anne, the Duchess of Brittany, the ruler of the country, married Charles VIII of France, and that started the unification of the Duchy of Brittany into France. It was finally ratified by François I of France in 1532. In return for surrendering its independence to France, Brittany retained its privileges, with most of its institutions being maintained, though the unification favoured the city of Rennes over Nantes, with most institutions being relocated to the northern city. During the mid-17th century, the siltation of the local salt pans and a fall in wine exports forced the city to look to new activities, with local ship owners moving from export to import, bringing sugar in from the French West Indies, and by 1700 the city was the largest port in France. With the growth in manufactured goods from the imports and sugar refineries and cotton mills springing up across Nantes in the 18th century, the city found itself being constrained by its walls, and their removal allowed Nantes to expand with the construction of many neoclassical squares and public buildings across the expanded city centre. On the 18th of July 1789, during the French Revolution, locals seized the castle of the Dukes of Brittany in an imitation of the storming of the Bastille 4 days earlier, but being a predominantly conservative Catholic area, the bulk of the population opposed the abolition of the monarchy and the submission of the clergy, so a rebellion began in 1793, leading to the Battle of Nantes on the 29th of June. After the Battle of Nantes, the National Convention decided to purge the city of its anti-revolutionary elements, and through a revolutionary tribunal notorious for its cruelty and ruthlessness that ran from October 1793 to February 1794, around 12,000 people, including women and children, were arrested, of which somewhere between 8 and 11,000 either died of typhus or were executed by guillotine, shooting, or being drowned in the Loire. The revolution was disastrous for the economy of Nantes, with trade falling from 237,716 tonnes in 1790 to just 43,242 tonnes by 1807. Nantes was overtaken by both Le Havre and Marseille, becoming more important ports, and Nantes lagged behind. A local elite, nostalgic for the pre-revolutionary Golden Age, which was suspicious of political and technological progress during the first half of the 19th century, held the city back, and it wasn't until 1851 that the city was finally connected to the French railway network, with a line to Paris opening by the Tours Saint-Nazaire Railway. From the second half of the century, the city began to rapidly industrialise, becoming a major industrial base for food processing and shipbuilding. Land reclamation programs in the early 20th century filled in many of the river channels flowing through the city, creating embankments and merging the smaller islands in the Loire into the much larger Île de Nantes. Land reclamation had only just been completed when the city was hit by the air raids of the Second World War. The city was captured by the Nazis on the 18th of June 1940 and remained under their control until they abandoned the city on the 12th of August 1944, shortly before the arrival of the French forces of the interior and the US Army. During those 4 years of occupation, the city was often the target of British and then American bombing raids, targeting the industrial facilities of the city that the Nazis had requisitioned for their war effort. The largest raids came in September 1943, when most of the industrial facility of Nantes, along with portions of the city centre, were wiped out by American bombs. Following the war, the city was at the centre of protests and strikes that gripped post-war France, culminating in the May '68 protests that led to civil unrest occurring throughout the country for nearly 2 months in May and June 1968. Despite the efforts of trade unions and protesters, the city was badly hit by the waves of deindustrialisation and stagnation that followed the 1970s global recessions, with many of its factories and shipyards closing. The last ship built in Nantes was floated into the Loire in 1986. In the decades that followed, the economy of the city shifted to become service-orientated. Since the mid-1980s, the city has set about rejuvenating itself with works in the heart of the old town, the restoration of many of the historic buildings, and the reinstating of the city's tramway in 1985, becoming the first French city to reintroduce trams after the system culls in the 1950s and 60s in favour of the car. The city has become a cultural centre in the country, running multiple annual festivals, renovating and rebuilding many museums, turning the former shipyards into creative hubs, including the Machine de Île, as well as addressing its darker past of the creation of a memorial to the abolition of slavery. One of those rebuilt museums is the Musée d'Histoire de Nantes, or the Nantes History Museum, which opened in the restored and rejuvenated Château des Ducs de Brittany in 2007. Construction on the castle first began sometime in the 13th century to provide a defensive base for Nantes, but it wasn't until Francis II in the 15th century that the castle became the main Breton ducal residence. In 1466, Francois wrote that his castle was in decline and in great need of repair, and decided to rebuild it entirely, calling upon the best architects in the duchy to assist. Works began that year and continued in fits and starts through various owners and battles before reaching its final completion in the mid-16th century. During the 17th century, the castle lost its political role and was instead turned into barracks for retired soldiers and invalids, as well as being used as a prison for distinguished prisoners. Over the centuries, the castle was visited by most French kings who passed through Brittany, but the last visitor was Louis XIV, who stayed in 1661. Just 9 years later, a fire destroyed the Grand Gouvernement. The king had it rebuilt in 17th century style, not particularly matching its surrounding buildings. In 1880, a rotten ceiling of the Spanish tower collapsed onto the powder reserves that was stored there, causing them to explode, destroying the tower and once again taking out the Grand Gouvernement. The damage also weakened the walls of the rest of the castle, meaning that it could no longer function as an effective prison. The castle remained under the control of the French army until the First World War, but during that time the historical and architectural importance of the Château was highlighted, and it was listed as a monument historique in 1840. The castle passed into the hands of the city in 1915, but due to the war effectively remained in the army's control up until 1920. In the period between the wars, the castle was opened up for the public, with a folk art museum being installed in part of the building. During the Nazi occupation, the castle came under the control of the German army, but despite this, the castle was spared the bombing raids of 1943, suffering only a few broken windows. After the war, 2 new museums, the Regional Popular Art Museum and the Decorative Art Museum, were opened in the building, but over the following decades, the building's rapid dilapidation was only arrested by small-scale repair works. By the end of the 20th century, several areas were closed for safety reasons, but with the growing cultural importance of the city, a decade-long campaign of complete restoration was undertaken, starting in 1997, which involved the whole site being closed for 3 years. With its reopening in 2007, the castle, its courtyard and ramparts, became as much a part of the exhibition as the museum that was opened inside the main buildings of the Château, telling the history of the city. With the removal of the city walls in the 18th century, Nantes expanded with many new squares and grand buildings constructed. Perhaps the most spectacular is the Place Royale, which was designed in 1786 and built in 1790. The fountain was added in 1865. Heavily damaged in the Second World War, it took until 1961 for it to be fully restored, at which point it became a roundabout dedicated to cars up until the late 2000s, when works to pedestrianise the centre of the city turned it back to as close as it would have looked when it was first built. Just behind the square is one of the city's 2 basilicas. These are in addition to its cathedral. Up on the hill to the east of the city centre is the Basilica of St. Donatien and St. Rogesian, dedicated to brothers Donatien and Rogesian, who were the first Christians in Nantes and martyred in the city at the end of the 3rd century. But down here in the city centre is the Basilica of St. Nicolas of Nantes. The current church dates from the early part of the 19th century, as a new grand church was built on the site of much older buildings. The first small church was built between the 11th and 12th centuries, and this church was then expanded a number of times from the middle of the 15th century onwards. By the middle of the 17th century, the bell tower was in danger of collapse, and fundraising to restore it required the sale of some of the church's treasures, including many precious books. Fundraising and works were slow, and it took over 100 years before renovation works were completed in 1772. With works barely completed, the parish decided the church needed to be completely reconstructed, with plans starting in 1773 and a decision on the future design made in 1789. But it took more than 50 years before works on the current building finally started in 1844, taking 25 years to complete, albeit the last 15 years mostly focused on the construction of the bell tower. The current church was consecrated in 1869 and was elevated to a minor basilica in 1882 by Pope Leo XIII. During the Allied bombing on the 16th of September 1943, the church, along with much of the surrounding area, was badly damaged. Reconstruction work on the basilica began in 1953 and lasted until 1974, though further works took place in the early 21st century to undo the damage caused to the stonework by the industrial pollution of the 20th century. Behind the church is one of the few remaining remnants of the old city fortifications, the base of the Porte Sauvetout still visible. A short distance away and you reach the city's cathedral, La Cathédrale Saint-Pierre-et-Saint-Paul de Nantes, constructed over 457 years from 1434 to 1891. The cathedral suffered a devastating arson attack in 2020, which caused significant damage. At the time of visiting in February 2025, works were still ongoing to restore the interior of the building, with works planned to be completed by the end of September 2025. Just behind the cathedral is the most intact part of the former city wall still standing, with the Porte Saint-Pierre. The gatehouse itself dates back to the 15th century, though some of the foundations from the Gallo-Roman period around the 3rd century, and the remains of the walls that stretch out beside the gate date from between the 9th and 13th centuries. Surviving the destruction of the rest of the city walls, the gatehouse went on to serve as a home for the City Museum from the 1920s until the 1960s, before they were transferred down the hill to the Château. Just behind the gate is the Place Maréchal-Foch, one of the most important squares in the city, built in the 18th century. In the centre of the square is a column topped with a statue of Louis XVI, one of only 5 statues of the last King of France visible in public spaces in the whole of the country. Whilst the main focus of the city after removal of the walls was the creation of grand squares and buildings, there was also a focus on green spaces, with the construction of the Jardin des Plantes de Nantes taking place in the early 19th century. There's been a botanical garden in one form or another in the city since 1687, when the master of the apothecaries was given the use of a plot of land to the west of the city. Helped by examples of tropical plants being brought back by sailors from their journeys around the globe to the port at Nantes, by 1719 the garden had become a royal garden of plants, a sub-branch of the Jardin du Roi in Paris. A royal ordinance issued by Louis XV in 1726 obliged captains of the ships of Nantes to bring seeds and plants from the colonies of foreign countries for the gardens of medicinal plants established in Nantes. Plans for an expansion of the garden were put on hold with the outbreak of the French Revolution, but the city would soon benefit from a decree of the National Convention in June 1793 that created a botanical garden of at least 4 acres in each département in the country. Works took some considerable time, with financial difficulties playing heavily on the delivery of the project and control of the garden having to be passed from the département to the city, before the garden finally opened to the public in 1829. The garden has continued to develop and expand over its near 200-year existence, with glasshouses and orangeries added by 1900 and themed gardens regularly added and amended. The last expansion to the gardens took place in the late 2010s when pedestrianisation of surrounding streets allowed for the gardens to expand by a further 320 square metres to bring them up to their current size of 7,328 hectares. Land reclamation of the Île de River has also led, eventually, to the creation of the city's Japanese gardens on the Île de Versaille. A small marsh until 1831, the island was created from spoil recovered from the digging of the Nantes to Brest Canal to create a 1.7 hectare island and the most downstream island on the Île de River. The island was purchased in 1840, at which point it was divided up into plots and resold to various owners who set up multiple businesses on the island, including laundries, carpentries, forges, tanneries and shipbuilding. With the much larger shipyards on the Loire taking away business, the island fell into disuse and was partially abandoned by the 1950s. Over the following years, the city slowly started to acquire the different plots of the island as they became available, with the final acquisition taking place in 1986, after which development work began to create a single unified Japanese garden across most of the island. At the heart of the garden is the Maison de l'Erde, a Japanese-inspired structure that surrounds a Zen garden and used as an exhibition space. The landscape created includes rockeries with waterfalls and other water features crossed by stepping stones and heavily planted with bamboo, bald cypresses, rhododendrons, camellias and Japanese cherry trees. Those shipyards on the Loire were a part of the story of the success of Nantes that saw it grow to the largest port in France by 1700. However, shortly afterwards the port became involved in the very lucrative but very evil triangular slave trade, where ships left Nantes for West Africa, picked up slaves and then shipped them over to the West Indies, before the ships returned with sugar and other exotic goods. From 1707 to 1793, Nantes was responsible for 42% of the French slave trade, with around 400,000 slaves sold by Nantes merchants, and that figure doesn't take into account the people who died before they reached the slaving ports in West Africa. With the French Revolution, the slave trade was abolished, but in the first decades of the 19th century the trade re-established itself, with Nantes being the last French port to conduct the now illegal Atlantic trade, continuing until about 1827. In that short period, the trade was even more brutal than before, with another estimated 400,000 slaves sold into the colonies. Opened in 2012, the Mémorial de l'Abolition de l'Esclavage, or Memorial to the Abolition of Slavery, is a monument to the horrific trade and the city's role in it. Built into the embankment below a 7,000 square metre promenade, almost at the same level as the Loire River, the exhibition area is designed to look like the area between decks of a slave ship. It charts the history of the movement to abolish slavery across the globe and the near 200-year-long campaign it took before the last country, Mauritania, finally abolished slavery in 1981, even if the trade still persists in modern forms today across the globe.
Constitue un crime contre l'humanité. Loi numéro 2001-434 du 21 mai 2001. Discussion et adoption le 10 mai 2001. France.
From the monument, it's a short walk over the Anne of Brittany Bridge and onto the Île de Nantes, the near 5 km long and 1 km wide island created in stages in the 19th and 20th century as the arms of the Loire were filled in, the smaller islands were slowly merged into one large island. Home to some of the largest industrial areas of the city, the west of the island was left almost derelict following the closures of the shipyards in 1987. 20 years after the closure of the last shipyard, and the space reopened as Les Machines de Île, an exhibition and entertainment space that was developed by the city along with theatre company La Machine, a street theatre company founded in 1999 that specialises in mechanical art projects, from 50-foot mechanical spiders to perhaps their most famous creation, Le Grand Éléphant, a 12-metre high, 8-metre long, 48.4-tonne wooden and steel elephant capable of carrying 50 passengers that walks around the site multiple times a day, capable of blowing water from its trunk and even trumpeting. But that's not the only attraction that's been built at the site, as a menagerie of mechanical animals in the Galerie des Machines and ocean's worth of steampunk shellfish and deep-sea creatures on the Carrousel du Mondes Marines, or Carousel of Marine Worlds, are also on the site to explore. The Carrousel first opened in 2012 and is made up of 3 layers stacked on top of each other, themed across 3 levels from the fonds marine, or seabed, through abyss, to the surface of the sea, or surface de la mer. Each layer has a number of mechanical creatures that you can ride on or in, with the passengers manipulating parts of the creatures with either pedals, pulleys, wheels or levers, while some of the creatures emit smoke, and a visit to the carousel includes a ride on one of the creatures. And of course, if a ride is included with the entry ticket, the carousel also doubles up as one of the boarding and alighting points for the Great Elephant. It's only really when you're down at ground level that you can appreciate the scale of both the carousel and the elephant, and the sheer amount of work and mechanics that goes into creating them. La Galerie des Machines houses many more of the mechanical marvels that have been created, several of them also large enough to accommodate passengers, from giant hummingbirds and caterpillars to herons that take flight, spiders that will give you nightmares for days, giant chameleons, complete with their trademark tongues, and even ride-on ants. Click on the link above or in the description to see the full show at normal speed in a separate video. But the main attraction is, of course, Le Grand Éléphant. During the day, the elephant struts backwards and forwards between the carousel and the main building, though the last ride of the night, the one I was booked onto, takes the elephant inside the main building to park it up for the evening. Boarding is via the stairs on the carousel or the air stairs out by the main building and onto a dedicated platform by the Galerie des Machines. The first of the attractions to open at Les Machines de Île, the elephant was originally designed to carry 35 passengers for a 30-minute round trip. Its capacity has grown over the years to 50, though due to its slow speed, averaging between 1 and 3 kilometres per hour, the length of the route was shortened and each journey lengthened to 45 minutes. Over the steel and wood structure, the elephant is covered in tulip wood with leather for the ears. The body is lubricated with 2,500 litres of hydraulic oil and since 2018 has run on electric traction from a hybrid engine and battery. Motion is controlled using 62 cylinders, 6 pneumatic, 10 gas powered and the rest hydraulic. Gare de Nantes has regular TGV services to Paris in just over 2 hours, as well as Intercités and TER services across the region. Aéroport de Loire-Atlantique is just 5 miles from the city centre and is a base for 3 low-cost carriers, EasyJet, Transavia and Volotea, with flights across much of Europe and North Africa, as well as links to Canada. There are direct flights to the major European hubs of Paris, Amsterdam, Frankfurt and Munich, as well as London Gatwick and Stansted for connections for the rest of the world.